everyone! So welcome to our next unit. So this unit is called Land based empires. So this is where we really get to talk about the development of the empires, including the gunpowder empires, which will be in the next video. So in this one, what we are going to do is we are going to look at the Manchu dynasty. It's made up of the Qing and also the Ming dynasty. So let's dive into a little bit of the objectives. So in this unit, we are looking at the imperial expansion that relied on the increased use of gunpowder, cannons, and armed trade. So in these land empires, in this video, we are focusing on Manchu in Central and East Asia. We're going to talk a lot about the recruitment of and use of the bureaucratic elites and how their role changed in government. When it comes to the tribute collection, tax and farming, and then tax collection in general, we're also going to look at how the Ming practiced collecting tax in the form of hard currency. And we're also going to look at the restrictive policies that were carried over against the Han Chinese in the Qing dynasty. So let's talk about it. So the last time we left off with Central and East Asia, we were talking about the Mongols. And so in this time period leading up to after the Yuan dynasty that we know was established by the Mongols and led by Kublai Khan, this created a very oppressive tax farming system, where Kublai Khan created this oppressive tax farming system. So instead of using the traditional fixed tax rate, he started to increase the amount that needed to be produced in the tax farming. This did bring about the benefits of securing trade routes and, exchange of experts between the East and the West. There was also this transmission of skills and ideas and information like we talked about with the Silk Roads. One of the things that Kublai Khan and the Yuan dynasty did is that they made Beijing their capital. So this was the eastern terminus of a lot of the caravan routes on the Silk Roads. And Kublai Khan created the Forbidden City, where it was the Forbidden Palace that would eventually become the Forbidden City. And what the Yuan dynasty actually really did that would have a lasting impact on China in particular would be the establishment of a social hierarchy where Mongols were at the top. So this is where we start to see this bureaucratic system being put in place. So at the top it was the Mongols, then you had Central Asians, Middle Easterners, Northern Chinese, and then finally the Southern Chinese. So to put it in perspective on a map, what we're looking at here is Beijing is here. You see the modern day dotted line, that's the modern day border of China. So it really is quite expansive. One of the things that we cannot forget is that Beijing was linked into the south by the Grand Canal, that huge thing that we started off the year talking about. So the Yuan dynasty actually was more cosmopolitan than a lot of the other dynasties in China. So some Confucian scholars were involved in the government, but they were largely displaced by the Mongols, who appointed merchants and outsiders to various government positions. So, for example, there was a Muslim governor from Central Asia that was placed in charge of an entire Chinese province. You also had Persians and Arabs and Uyghurs who were administrators and staffed the offices of, tax and finance. You also saw a lot of Muslim scholars who worked at calendar making and astronomy. So you really do, again, start to see this blend of cultures happening. So the economy of the Yuan dynasty was very much merchants were the privileged group. You also saw the decreased importance of the civil service exam, which, our modern day civil service exam is modeled after. You saw elite families who turned to new professions and opportunities since government positions were no longer available to them. You saw this business and merchant class boom in China. Agricultural base was damaged by the war waged by Mongols, and this tax farming system also put a damper on agricultural. And then you have the passage of armies. So the Yuan dynasty actually tried to impose the use of paper money, but there was just very little faith in the system, and people didn't quite understand paper money versus, coin or traded goods. So ultimately you had the fall of the Yuan dynasty. So in about the 1340s, there were fights that broke out amongst Mongol princes, and one charismatic Chinese leader would step up. Hong Wu was the emperor that destroyed the Yuan Empire and brought about the Ming dynasty. So many Mongols, as well as Muslims, Jews, and Christians, remained in China. Many other Mongols returned to Mongolia. They went back to their home. And these refugees were welcomed back from the Yuan collapse. The Ming did not dominate all the Mongols, but they did, participate with the remaining tribes by using the tribute system. So they did bring some things back. And then some also became a continued threat along those Ming borders. So this is bringing back that dynastic cycle of change and the whole mandate of heaven. And yeah, so the Chinese culture and civilization in the Ming Dynasty, or before the Ming Dynasty, had been disrupted by the Mongol rule. The population had been greatly reduced by the plague. Early decades of the Ming Dynasty were basically just efforts to eliminate all signs of foreign rule. So they got rid of the Mongol names. They got rid of the Mongol dress. Like anything that outwardly spoke it, or outwardly said Mongol, got rid of it. And they started to promote the Confucian learning again, those models that we saw in the Han, the Tang, and the Song dynasties. And Emperor Yongli sought to compile all previous writing on history, geography, and ethics, and so much more, because China was really looking to its past for inspiration and how to move forward with its future. So one of the things that the Ming did was move the capital to Nanjing, and that was the southern capital. And they used Confucianism to legitimize Yongli's rule. It did initially end all relations with Central Asia and into the Middle East. It imposed strict limits on imports and foreign visitors. And then silver would replace paper money. It was not a good choice by any means, but they did it. And then Emperor Yongli would eventually move the capital back to Beijing, and Yongli would actually add to the Forbidden Palace, making it the Forbidden City that we know today. So here is Nanjing and Beijing to the north. Now, if you remember back to the map of the Grand Canal, Nanjing is on the Grand Canal route. So the Forbidden City, it's Beijing, China, and it was built during the Ming and the Qing dynasties. So let's watch a short little video about the Forbidden City, or showing you the Forbidden City. It is gorgeous and so big. And one of the reasons why the Forbidden City there is so much red is because in China, in the Chinese culture, red is the color of good luck. So, by re-establishing the civil service examination system that, had long been neglected, the Ming Dynasty sought to increase their political power. Then this re-established the highly centralized government. Power was concentrated into the hands of the emperor, while eunuchs, castrated men, were pledged their loyalty to the emperor, and they, exercised great authority because of it. They would restore millions of acres of land to cultivate crops once again. They built canals, reservoirs, irrigation systems, and they planted 1 billion trees to reforest China. And under Yongli, the economy actually would rebound, and international and domestic trade would flourish, creating this huge population growth once again. And during the 15th century, that's the 1400s, China had recovered and was the best governed and most prosperous of the world's major civilizations. The Ming Dynasty is probably best known for its porcelain. They created what's called Mingware. It's a blue on white style of pottery or porcelain that was developed in the 1400s from India and Central Asia and Eastern motifs. It's also known for furniture, lacquered screens, and silk, but the most talked about is the Ming Dynasty porcelain, as you can see here. So Emperor Yongli actually oversaw the construction of what's called the Porcelain Tower in Nanjing. It's a historical site that's on the bank of the river. Sometimes considered one of the 7 wonders of the world, the tower was built with white porcelain bricks. It was said that these bricks would actually reflect the sun's rays during the day, and at night as many as 140 lamps were hung from the building so that you could see the tower, or it would illuminate it. There are glazes and stoneware that were worked into the porcelain, they created a mixture of green, yellow, and brown and white designs on the sides of the tower that featured flowers, animals, and landscapes. And it was mostly destroyed in the 19th century during what's called the Taiping Rebellion, which we'll talk about later. So this is a closer image of what is called the Porcelain Tower. So since the 11th century, Chinese sailors and traders had been a major presence in South China, and especially in the Southeast Asian port cities. Well, under Emperor Yongli, they would launch an enormous fleet in 1405, which participated in 7 expeditions in 28 years. And one of the captains of these ships would actually be somebody we have talked about before, the Muslim eunuch Zheng He. He would captain one of the 300 ships and oversee a crew of 27,000. They would visit ports all along the Southeast Asia, India, Indonesia, Arabia, and East Africa. And they wanted to enroll distant peoples in the Chinese tributary system, and so that they could acknowledge that China was the best overall, right? So we have looked at we've looked at the difference between the Chinese ships and Columbus ships, and we all pretty much agree that we would want to rather be on the Chinese ships versus the caravels. So Zheng He's expeditions were officially described as bringing order to the world. It also established Chinese power and prestige in the Indian Ocean, while also being able to exert their control over foreign trade. So part of China's legacy is this tribute system that we keep talking about over and over and over again. The Chinese did not seek to conquer new territories. They did not establish Chinese settlements, and they did not desire to spread their culture. What actually ended up happening was spreading Islamic beliefs on, Zheng He's mission, it was not the official policy of the Ming Dynasty to spread Confucian or Islamic beliefs. They were just trying to create a tributary system. But then, all of a sudden, after 1433, Chinese authorities just stopped the expeditions. And they allowed the expensive fleet to just deteriorate in the ports. And this was partly because of the death of Emperor Yongle, as he was the patron of the enterprises. And then many high-ranking officials had seen the voyages of just a huge waste of resources, because they thought that China should be focusing on domestic policies and becoming more self-sufficient versus going to the outside world. So they essentially saw expeditions as a hobby of the eunuchs who government officials despised. So they saw the real threat coming from within. So from the north, from those nomadic barbarians, those Mongols, that still troubled the borders. So the Ming decline. So they had problems defending their own borders. They had very weak emperors, a lot of corruption, a lot of court factions that were just bickering back and forth. During this period, they also saw a lot of rebellions. And then you have the Manchurians, those foreign nomads from just beyond the Great Wall, who won the Mandate of Heaven. And they would rename the empire the Qing Dynasty, which means pure. They were not Han Chinese, and the Manchus were considered barbarians from the north. And so they would found and maintain a new era for China. So the Manchu gained control of Beijing and began to campaign to conquer the rest of China. This would happen by the late 18th century, and China at that point would reach the largest size in its history, and it would become the largest country in the world. As they transitioned from the Ming to the Qing, it wasn't as difficult as a transition as other dynasties had been, because the Manchus had been close to Chinese civilization and had adapted many of those customs and attitudes. So some gave their support to the Manchus in taking over the government. So it was not a bloody fight. It was more peaceful. I'm not going to say it's completely peaceful, but it was more peaceful than expected. Then you see the expansion of the Qing. So they did reject a maritime empire, but they built a massive land empire, and they incorporated many different diverse peoples in this group. There was an 80-year military campaign that brought nomadic victories of Mongolia, Xinjiang, and also Tibet. They conquered for security reasons, not economic reasons. Russian expansion was a concern, but it was ultimately resolved diplomatically rather. The Qing would ultimately just take over Central Asia. They would use the technology and the resources that they had to be able to expand. They ruled the new territory through a separate government called the Court of Colonial Affairs, where they would use Mongolian aristocrats, Muslim officials, and Buddhist leaders. And then they would use these local leaders. These local leaders would sometimes abuse power, like they all do. But the one thing that they did is that they did not ask conquered people to assimilate into Chinese culture. They showed respect to Mongolians, Muslims, and the Tibetans. So they allowed them to continue their own cultures and their own religions, but be conquered regions under a Chinese government. So this is a map showing you the expansion of the Qing dynasty. So because of this, they expanded their power and influence. They added many non-Chinese populations to China. Their border was very close to what we see as modern China's borders today, and they ended this practice of the cosmopolitan Eurasia Silk Road tradition. So now trade was controlled by Russia and China. Central Asia, however, did become more impoverished, and the land-based trade was ultimately giving away to Indian trade as Europeans were no longer using the Silk Road. So you saw pastoral groups that had to give up herding and move to cities. that means there was more free herding grounds to those who remained. The Qing also encouraged this separation between Manchu and Chinese. So highest posts were filled by Manchus. Confucian scholars, the gentry, kept most of the positions in the bureaucracy. Manchu rulers wanted to preserve their ethnic identity, so they forbid intermarriage between Han Chinese and Manchus. Chinese men were forced to shave the front of their heads and grow queue as a sign of submission to the dynasty, and I'll show you what a picture of what this looks like in just a second. Civil service exams became more competitive, with tests given on district, provincial, and metropolitan levels. So that's like federal government, state government, and then like city or county governments. The state was tightly controlled at its center. The emperor was seen as son of heaven. The emperor led secluded but very privileged life at the Forbidden City, where he was kept away from everything. And it became more apparent that they were becoming a theater state, that they had these huge palaces and grand customs. They had expensive emperor's clothing, and they very much continued the practice of the Kowtow to show a sign of respect. So again, Forbidden City, Kowtow that we know, and then here are the lovely hairstyles. So antiquity to the Ming Dynasty, you saw this. It's very much reminiscent of what we have looked at in the movie Milan, right? Where it's just like this bun on top of your head. Well, to distinguish between the Manchus and the Han Chinese, the Han Chinese had to shave the front part of their head and grow their hair long in the back. It's kind of like a weird version of a mullet. So it's like super short, shaved in the front, party in the back, right? And then after the revolution, the Republic of China, this became the norm. This a regular short hairstyle for men. And here is a better picture of it. There are lots of movies, lots of depictions of this hairstyle in certain movies. So the Manchu dynasty actually strengthened two leaders in particular, and together the rule would span 130 years. They cemented a prosperous, powerful, culturally rich empire. They were both sophisticated Confucian scholars, and they managed the Chinese economy very efficiently. So Kang Shi was a talented military leader, and Shi Long brought a lot of prosperity through the canceled tax collection, because he canceled it 4 times. By the late 18th century, China was a well-organized empire. Its influence firmly established in most parts of East Asia. I highly encourage you to go watch this video on the page to show you the elaborate dress. We'll talk about this in class. Alright, so the Qing dynasty's economic gains were pretty awesome. Their prosperity was based on the regrowth of their agriculture through high yields. You would see rice, wheat, and millet be grown on grand scales again. They would also incorporate new foods from the Columbian Exchange, like maize, sweet potatoes, peanuts. They were all raised on soil, but, not appropriate for previous crops. You also saw new foods that could sustain a rapid increase of population, because at this point in time, population definitely outpaced food supply, but that was not evident before 1750. You had population growth that was supported by trade, so the influx of American silver saw go through the roof. Chinese workers also would produce silk, porcelain, and tea to be sold at a grand scale. And then you also saw new silver supplies that would also generally help the Chinese economy. One of the things that does not disappear is this patriarchal society that we have talked about before. One of the things that you saw that we talked about before was this control over women, and this increased in the late Ming to Qing dynasties, especially as those Confucian ideals came back into practice full force. In Chinese society, there was a preference for male children because only males could take the civil service exam, which could boost the family's status or social status. Women were seen as objects, essentially. Women were very much encouraged to commit suicide after her husband's death. Foot binding continued to be popular and actually grew in popularity again during this time. Women's right to divorce their husbands was taken away, and men could even put wives aside for disobedience or adultery. So if you were female and your husband at all decided that he was done with you, then he could be done with you. He could get a divorce, but you could not petition to get one. It's awesome. So there was a higher status at this point in time for scholar bureaucrats. There was distinct clothing. Their income from the government was very nice. They lived in the cities. They owned land that brought additional income, but they very rarely set foot on it. Below this scholar bureaucrats were the gentry, the peasants, the artisans, and the merchants. Merchants, once again, saw a low status in life, and yeah. Wah, wah. But merchants were actually considered honest work. Peasants were actually deemed more worthy than merchants, because peasants were actually the ones who were working hard, while merchants were seen as not really being creative or hardworking. So, sorry, merchants. And then the lower level class were often called mean people, and these would be slaves, indentured servants, and beggars. So here's that social class that we see. Wah, wah, poor merchants. Dang. So some of the things that were left behind by the Qing dynasty was a very rich culture. You saw a Neo-Confucianism culture that displayed the emergence of philosophy and literature and history. Emperors supported printing and distributed materials on a mass scale. Yongli actually sponsored the Yongli Encyclopedia, and then you saw the Kangshi's collection of books. So the popular novels that circulated too often, the best known novels were The Book of the Golden Lotus and The Dream of the Red Chamber. So this is what those look like there. So I will let you guys read a little bit about the Kangxi Dynasty's dictionary. It contained more than 47,000 characters, though some 40% of them are graphic variants that you can see a little bit here. There are rare or archaic characters, and some of which are attested only once. There are fewer than a quarter of characters that are featured that it contains, that are most commonly used now. So porcelain continued to be a very big deal in the Ming and Qing dynasties. Vases and decorative bowls, the painted scrolls and screens were in high demand. Prices rose as production increased, and prosperous Chinese also filled homes with goods such as these. And by the 1700s, many Chinese could read, and children went to schools. Yeah, they could write in calligraphy, paint, write poetry, and members of the scholar gentry also led very refined and comfortable lives. But unfortunately, there would be issues with trade. From the Crusades onward, Western elites had become used to this increasing consumption of Asian luxury products. Higher demand. So in exchange for these luxury products, Europeans had cruder goods to offer: wool, tin, copper, honey. And this resulted in an unfavorable balance of trade. So enter gold. So they started to use gold, but Western Europe only had a limited supply of this. And by the 1400s, the constant drain to Asia was creating a gold famine that threatened the entire European economy with collapse until the Spanish would